What's up, everybody? I'm back with another episode focused on science-based lifting. Now, whether you're a self-proclaimed optimal lifting nerd or you think science-based lifting is just an excuse to not train hard or a way to sell programs, stick around because I think this episode is going to have something for you. For a little bit of context, I recently criticized some science-based tiers lists videos and some of the exercises that were selected there. So I figured, to be fair, I should put my money where my mouth is and come up with my own rankings. So that's what this video is all about. We'll be focusing on the quads in this video, and I want to focus on what the science actually can tell us about optimal quad training and what's just clickbait, sensationalized headlines, and then where we just kind of have to make an educated guess and apply a little bit of practical experience. As I discuss some specific exercises, I'm going to review some fundamental training principles that will hopefully allow you to think critically about exercise selection with a wide range of muscle groups in the future, and ultimately decide for yourself where these exercises should be ranked. Whether I say they're A tier, B tier, whatever, that's not really the point of this video, as much as illustrating some of these deeper underlying concepts and allowing you to make the decision for yourself. Let's start with the leg extension, as this is the exercise on which the vast majority of quad hypertrophy research has actually been performed. Compared to exercises like squats, leg extensions are traditionally highlighted as a exercise for the rectus femoris. That's the one quad muscle that not only extends the knee, but it also flexes the hip, serves as the hip flexor. For that reason, squatting type movements generally don't grow the rectus femoris very much. We need some sort of leg extension or sissy squat, reverse Nordic, something like that that isolates knee extension to be able to grow that muscle very well. That much the science can tell us pretty reliably. However, I think it's important to note that the leg extension isn't just a rectus femoris exercise. It does train all of the heads of the quads fairly well. In fact, this recent study compared quad growth in both the rectus femoris and the vastus lateralis between squats and leg extensions, and we saw pretty good growth in the vastus lateralis in both the leg extension and the squats. What was interesting, though, about this study is that they measured hypertrophy at different portions along the muscle. So they looked at the more distal portion, so closer to the knee. They looked at the midpoint of the muscle, and then they looked more proximally closer to the hip. And what they found was that, as expected, the squats grew the vastus lateralis a little bit more overall, but we saw more proximal gains in the vastus lateralis from the leg extension than we did from the squats. In fact, we saw really significant hypertrophy proximally for the vastus lateralis from leg extensions. But I thought that was interesting because when you kind of stack the two together, you get a really nice complementary effect where you're getting a lot of rectus femoris hypertrophy from the leg extension, you're getting a lot of distal and midpoint vastus lateralis hypertrophy from the squats, and then you're also getting some of that proximal vastus lateralis hypertrophy from the leg extension as well. So even though the leg extension is generally highlighted as a rec fem exercise, it's possible that if we want to maximize total vastus lateralis thickness, we may actually observe a little bit of a complementary effect here, potentially as a result of the different resistance profiles between squats and leg extensions. Squats, of course, are tougher in the bottom of the lift, the more lengthened portion of the lift, and that has generally been observed to lead to more distal gains in the trained muscle, whereas leg extensions, they're going to challenge that vastus lateralis muscle more in the shortened position, which has generally been associated with more proximal gains. To be clear, regional hypertrophy, this idea of more proximal gains versus distal gains from lengthened versus shortened bias exercises, this research is very much in its infancy. But when we do start to compare exercises and look at gains along the full length of the muscle, looking at the proximal portion, looking at the midpoint, looking distally, when we do that and we see differences between exercises as we do here, I think it's hard to be able to say that this exercise is better versus this exercise is better. Maybe we see one exercise leads to more growth on average or more growth overall. But if we are seeing differences in regional hypertrophy, maybe some complementary effect, I think that we should be open to the idea of needing multiple exercises to maximize total hypertrophy. And odds are, knowing what we know about minimum effective dose, it's probably not a case where you need to do a ton of leg extensions or a ton of any one of these exercises. If we see that an exercise has a unique benefit you're probably going to be able to get most of that benefit from just a couple of sets. What I think is difficult about tiers lists is they're often very much a one-to-one comparison where we're comparing one set of squats to one set of leg extensions, what's going to lead to more hypertrophy. Whereas in the real world, maybe we're comparing not this exercise versus this exercise, but say if I've already done 4 sets of a lengthened position exercise for a 5th set, should I just do a 5th set of that lengthened exercise? Or would I get more gains, maybe gains in muscle regions that I've been neglecting if I add 1 set of something else? So, 4 sets of squats plus 1 set of leg extensions, maybe that's actually what's going to maximize total vastus lateralis thickness. I don't know for sure, and quite frankly, I don't think anybody does. With regards to the leg extension for the rec fem specifically, it has become popular to do the leaning back variation, as the data showing that the reclined leg extension grew the rec fem a little bit more than an upright leg extension. I think the data here was pretty good, but still some limitations. Untrained lifters, short term, all that kind of stuff. It's very possible that over the long term and more trained lifters that effect size shrinks quite a bit. However, I do think the data and the underlying mechanisms, when we look at the muscle links being trained for the rec fem specifically, I think we still are probably going to see a little bit better growth in the reclined variation. But what I think is interesting about this study and why I'm so shocked that people have kind of run so far with it is none of the studies using the lean back leg extension were actually fully lengthening the rec fem or getting close to what I would consider a full stretch. The biggest study, the most popular study, had a hip angle of 40 degrees, so they could have leaned back quite a bit more, all the way to 0, or even gone into additional hip extension beyond that. The knee flexion angle was 110 degrees, so they could have gone, an additional 40, 50 degrees there as well. So there was a ton of additional length they could have gotten out of the rec fem. And for that to occur, you need to do an exercise like a Sissy squat or a reverse Nordic. So we don't actually have any data showing that training the rec fem at those extreme muscle lengths is going to be better than just training it at the moderate lengths that we saw in the lean back leg extension. Unfortunately, that hasn't stopped people from running with the data, not only with the rec fem saying that, reverse Nordics and Sissy squats are the best quad exercises ever because they get the most stretch, but they've even taken it so far as to use it to say you should go ass to grass and squats and that kind of thing, which now we're talking about different muscles altogether. We're talking about ranges of motion that we're not studying here, but we'll get into that more in a minute as well. For now, let's talk about some of these exercise variations like the reverse Nordic, the Sissy squat, and see if they live up to the evidence-based hype. Now, the reverse Nordic, first on the list, this is essentially a lengthened partial. You're in full hip extension. You're starting at 90 degrees of knee flexion and then leaning all the way back. It's a pretty steep slope as far as the resistance profile. When you're at the top of the rep, there's no challenge at all. And then it quickly gets much, much more challenging. So it's really only tough at the very bottom. It's kind of a very partial lengthened partial, very kind of narrow band of challenge with the exercise. Once you get about halfway up, it's not very challenging anymore. What you miss out on here is really any challenge at moderate muscle lengths, and you completely skip over the shortened position of the range. So basically what you're doing is you're giving up some moderate muscle lengths, which we know cause growth. You're giving up some short muscle lengths where maybe that's responsible for some of the additional proximal hypertrophy of the vastus lateralis we saw in the leg extension. Maybe you're giving that up to chase the extreme stretch of the rec fem, which we can't say for sure. We don't really have any data to suggest that extreme stretch is going to be any better than more moderate muscle lengths. So it's kind of a toss-up. You're giving up some things that we know cause growth to maybe optimize a variable that we don't have data on, kind of extrapolating there. So overall, I wouldn't consider it a science-based exercise. It's a lot of speculation involved. I'm all for mobility for mobility's sake. If we can at least assume that it's non-inferior, that you're still going to get some good rec fem growth out of it, I think it's a fine variation. What I don't like about reverse Nordics though, and why I'm so shocked that so many evidence-based lifters and content creators have jumped on the reverse Nordic hype train, is that it's just not a loadable variation for advanced lifters. especially if you're someone who has shorter femurs, a relatively long torso. Like for me, I can't even do a full range of motion reverse Nordic unweighted. I can't do one at all without my knees coming off the ground and tipping over backwards. So that has nothing to do with strength and everything to do with center of mass. If you're someone that has longer legs, like if you have long femurs, I think you're going to be able to load it up a little bit more before you run into center of mass problems. But ultimately, you're just not going to be able to load it very heavy. And unlike a lot of other exercises, like the leg extension, for example, when you load that really, really heavy, it has a tendency to want to kind of catapult you or eject you out of the seat. You can at least strap into the handles. You could use a seat belt to hold yourself down onto the seat. But with the reverse Nordic, there is not any real practical way to tie your knees down onto the ground so that you can lean back with a lot of weight in your hands and not tip over. So we don't actually have the data to support that extreme stretch being superior to moderate muscle lengths. It's not super loadable for advanced athletes, but if it feels good to you and you can challenge yourself, knock yourself out. I still do choose to train a fully lengthened rec fem. I just do it with a kneeling cable leg extension. I've been able to go extremely heavy on this exercise with no stability limitations at all. I can do the full stack plus some. I've been able to do the full stack with no hands. That's how easy the exercise is to stabilize. You're also able to really anchor your back leg into a position of full hip extension. So you get a really, really good stretch on all of the hip flexors the whole time. So if I am going to try to train a fully lengthened rec fem, the kneeling leg extension is my go-to. There's just a little bit more setup involved. If you're really strong, it's a great option for a fully lengthened rec fem. If you're more of a novice, I think that the reverse Nordic is really convenient. You'll be able to jump right into that a little bit more quickly. The Sissy squat is another option that fully stretches that rec fem, or at least mostly depending on your technique. Some people don't get full knee flexion on it, which is okay. Its resistance profile also extends a little bit further into mid-range. So compared to a reverse Nordic, which feels very partially, it's really only tough for a moment and then you're in the clear again. The Sissy squat, I think, is really tough at the bottom, but it's still pretty tough kind of into that mid-range. It's not until you're most of the way to the top of the rep and nearing full knee extension that you can really relax and get some tension off. So I think the effective resistance profile is much wider on it. It's also easier to load without falling over. So whereas with the reverse Nordic, eventually you're going to tip over backwards and it's hard to hold your knees down. With the Sissy squat, you can really load it as heavy as you want. You can hold a single weight at your chest. You can put a backpack on. You can do a safety bar and do like a Hatfield variation. So there's a lot of ways that you can load it up really heavy, and there's not going to be any limitations with managing your center of mass, which is really nice. The only potential limiting factor you run into is just foot and ankle and toe discomfort. For some people, that's a bigger deal than others. For a lot of people, it's just a matter of sticking with the exercise long enough to kind of overcome that. But I think for most relatively strong athletes, it's actually a really great variation. In fact, I'd even agree with Milo on this, that it's one of the most underrated quad exercises there is. Big fan of it, especially if you're strong enough to be able to do a machine version. Like if you get on a hack squat and do a Sissy hack squat, as the legend Tom Platz used to do. Absolutely fantastic exercise. People can do a banded version of that, reverse banded, tons of range of motion for your rec fem, super stable, a tough one to beat. Still, the only option that really loads terminal knee extension is going to be some sort of machine leg extension variation, whether reclined or not. And while you could argue that that's a shortened partial, I do still think there's some unique benefits to that, just from knees feeling good perspective. Possibly from some proximal growth for the vastus lateralis. I don't think it's something that you should discard entirely. Overall, I'd say leg extensions, A tier to B tier, depending on the nuances of your setup and the machine that you're working with. Reverse Nordics, I gotta put it at B tier. There's just too much hype around training the extreme stretch that isn't fully deserved. I don't like the loading limitations of it. I'd say for an advanced athlete, I'd have to knock it down even to C tier. But for a novice to intermediate athlete, I think it's solidly in B tier still. The cable leg extension, the one that I like to do quite a bit, I'm tempted to put it in A tier just because of how much I personally enjoy the exercise. I really like being able to still fully lengthen that rec fem. I think it feels really good. But I just can't justify ranking it any higher than a traditional leg extension. I just don't think that's a fair assessment. So I'm gonna have to put it in B tier overall, but I'll put the asterisk that it is unmatched, unparalleled for rec fem and general hip flexor mobility. You can anchor that back leg down, get a crazy stretch for the whole set. So if you are trying to work on that mobility and want some great rec fem hypertrophy in a process, I think it's fantastic. Sissy squats for beginners, I gotta rank it B tier just because I think the stability, the coordination, trying to give yourself enough assistance, whether it's with bands or hand support or otherwise, can make the exercise feel a little awkward and cumbersome overall. So it's not an exercise I'd give to a novice, but I think once you're out of that stage, once you're relatively strong, I think that they're super underrated, especially once you get onto like a machine variation. So agree with Milo on this one. Sissy squats are underrated, absolutely A tier. Now, all of that said, just like rice and beans are both incomplete proteins, but they're a complete protein when you eat them together, I think that you can take 2 B tier quad exercises or 2 B tier any exercises and stack them together in a way that you get an A tier stimulus. For example, if you only have a really shitty leg extension machine with a wonky resistance profile that feels off and you're leaned upright, if you pair that with something like a reverse Nordic that's very partially, very stretch focused, you're missing out on that mid-range and shortened resistance at the end. If you do those exercises together, like I used to superset leg extension reverse Nordics together, even though I think individually those variations of those exercises might be B tier, I think the combo set takes it back up to A tier. Takes a little bit more time, but if that's what you're working with, I think it can be a great option as well. Now, moving on to compound exercises, this part gets a little bit trickier because how we rank these exercises, some people could interpret as just how much they still isolate the quads versus train other muscle groups as well. For example, something like a high bar back squat, fantastic quad exercise, but it's also a huge adductor exercise, to a slightly lesser extent, a glute exercise, compared to something like a pendulum squat that is going to be a little bit more quad isolated. It's not going to bring in those other muscle groups as much. I don't think that that's a compelling enough reason to rank one of them higher than the other on some sort of tiers list. I think it's more just a matter of understanding big picture exercise programming principles and knowing how to manage systemic fatigue, know how to account for a big compound exercise that trains a lot of muscles at once, but might also be a little bit more tiring. You know, maybe you do a hard set of pendulum squats, you need 2 or 3 minutes. You do a hard set of high bar back squats, you need 3 or 4 minutes, but you've also got a little bit more adductor stimulus. I think there's a lot of variables there that we have to account for, and we can't just say that one is inherently better than the other. But I digress. Let's get into them. I was appalled to see the pendulum squat ranked so low on a recent tiers list. So I want to start talking about pendulum squats, and on that note, banded hack squats or reverse banded hack squats as well. Now, a common theme today is that an overreach of science is saying that because a little bit of something is good, that more must be better. And this is something that comes up with the criticisms of the pendulum squat and the banding of hack squats. The argument goes something like this. If we want a lengthened bias resistance challenge, why would you add a band? Why would you use an art if that's going to make the exercise more challenging towards the top when we know that the growth happens at the bottom? That's how the argument goes. Zero research actually shows that to be the case. Again, looking at the quad data, even from the leg extension studies, we can see that some lengthened bias challenge is good. We don't know that more is better or that taking it to the extreme is going to give you the best results. That's just an overreach and an extrapolation of the data that we cannot confidently make. In fact, we see a lot of logical inconsistencies here in that people don't apply that logic to other exercises like the bicep curl. For example, if you truly believed that we should make the exercise toughest in the bottom position, then we wouldn't do preacher curls at an angle like this. We would do preacher curls with the arm totally flat, where it would be absolutely the toughest at full extension, but instead people will drop their arms. They'll have it at like a 45-degree angle, a 30-degree angle, so that the toughest part of that preacher curl is actually going to be kind of in the mid to lengthened range, not at true terminal elbow extension. I think intuitively, people don't generally do bicep curls with their arm totally flat because they get just a little bit of challenge right at the bottom, and then they're missing out on a lot of that mid-range stimulus, which again, I think intuitively they know is probably a good idea. As an aside, I don't actually hate that bicep variation. In fact, in some of my programs, I've done some traditional curls, arms down by my side, and then done a set of like flat straight arm curls. But that's neither here nor there. I don't think it's inherently optimal to do that. They're all just valid variations. But moving on, the real part here that I think the evidence-based lifters don't account for or don't describe accurately is when you do a squat and you start moving down and your knees are traveling forward, it's that forward knee travel relative to the path of resistance that's making the exercise feel tougher in that position. If you add a little bit of band resistance or chain resistance or other form of accommodating resistance to an exercise like a squat, yes, it's going to shift the resistance profile a little bit. It's going to shift the sticking point a little bit, but it's still very much going to be limited by your strength in the bottom position to the mid-range position. The amount of band resistance or chain resistance you would have to add to a squat to be failing anywhere near lockout would be insane. I've seen people ego lift the hell out of the hack squat, put so many bands on there, it's absurd, way more bands than I would ever recommend, and still I've never seen anyone actually struggle in the top half of the lift. They're still struggling near the bottom or mid-range, and we don't have the data to suggest that failing at the extreme muscle lengths at full knee flexion, we don't have the data to say that that is any more optimal than failing at 120 degrees of knee flexion or 90 degrees of knee flexion for the vastus muscles in particular. Does that mean it's going to be better to band it? Maybe, maybe not. I have no idea. If you do what you feel is comfortable, consider them both equally fantastic options. I think that's fine. I think trying to argue against banded hack squats or argue against pendulum squats by using research is an abuse of science. In fact, recent studies looking at leg press step showed no difference between full range and partial range of leg press for quad hypertrophy. And yeah, these evidence-based people will come out and say, oh, but we didn't have that study, we didn't have that data. We didn't need that data to know that arguing against pendulum squats or banded hacks was an overstep of the existing data. We already knew that was dumb. Don't try to pretend like we have new data that's allowing you to backpedal on that stance. There was never a time when we had enough data to confidently say that banding a hack squat or doing a pendulum squat was not evidence-based. We have never been able to say that. Anyone who has ever said that was not looking at the data. They were looking at extrapolations and exaggerations of the data, plain and simple. To summarize the squat conversation, I'd consider hack squats, pendulum squats, banded squat options, really any machine squat variation, even barbell squat variation. I'm going to put them all in A tier. Now, the caveat or the asterisk there is that the main reason that you might want to pick a variation that isolates the quads a little bit more like a pendulum versus more of a big all-arounder exercise like a barbell squat is going to be the context of your overall program and overall exercise selection. If you're someone who has a little bit less time, for example, you're probably going to want to pick exercises that accomplish more with one thing. A barbell back squat is going to be a massive stimulus for a lot of muscles, whereas if you're doing a pendulum squat, yeah, you're getting a huge quad stimulus, but you're not going to be getting as much for the glutes and adductors. You may need even additional exercise to match what you're getting with the barbell. If you have more time and freedom, especially if you're a more advanced athlete, you are probably going to want to pick exercises that bias specific tissue a little bit more, maybe have broader exercise selection overall, but it really comes down to personal preference, logistical constraints, and your training environment. It's all going to work really, really well. So for that reason, I'm putting all of those exercises in A tier. They just all get a little asterisk as there's going to be circumstances where one might make a little bit more sense than the other, but ultimately they're all going to grow your quads extremely well. This brings me to the topic of axial load or axial fatigue. This is an area or a topic that I think evidence-based lifters have taken a little bit too far. And now we have a culture of basically glassbacks that are always trying to minimize axial load, minimize spinal loading and axial fatigue and systemic fatigue. And I think it's gotten to the point that it's a little bit silly. Basically, when we say axial fatigue, well, what we really mean is just your back is tired. If your back is a little bit tired, that's okay. What we don't want is your back to become a big limiting factor where your ability to train hard starts, going downhill. It's not a matter of minimizing axial fatigue. It's a matter of managing axial fatigue and just making sure it doesn't become excessive or cross that threshold where your training quality starts to suffer. In fact, having some tolerance for axial fatigue and embracing some axial fatigue is going to open up some more exercise options to you that may allow you to train more muscle, more tissue at once. Do a barbell back squat now and again or a bent over barbell row. If you try to make up a full program exclusively of very high axial fatigue exercises that tire your back out a ton, it's not going to be sustainable. You're probably not going to feel very good, but having a few exercises like that could add some efficiency to your program, be fun, and it's not going to cost you anything in the long run. What's funny to me and what I think a lot of people leave out of the discussion when it comes to stimulus to fatigue ratio and axial fatigue or load is that if you fear axial fatigue too much and you're only going to do unilateral options, for example, that kind of carries with it another type of fatigue. If you're doing lunges and split squats instead of squats because you want to minimize axial fatigue, now you're having to do twice as many sets and you're going to have the bar on your back for twice as long. There's going to be more cardiovascular fatigue. Now there's more fatigue of your deep hip rotators and muscles in your feet, for example, with stability. So you end up just getting tired in slightly different ways. When I do a ton of heavy lunges, split squats, go all in on a bunch of heavy single leg stuff, I'll get some SI joint discomfort, that kind of thing. So it's not so much a matter of being able to optimize the stimulus to fatigue ratio by avoiding axial load or anything like that. I think it's just a matter of pulling exercises from different buckets, different categories as kind of a way to foolproof your program and make sure you're not just overloading a ton of stimulus on one thing. You're not picking only exercises that add a bunch of stress to your back. You're not only picking exercises that add a lot of stress onto your hip. When it comes to trying to minimize axial load or minimize stability demands or whatever, I don't think that we can apply that to every single exercise individually. It's more about optimizing it on a whole program level. This brings me to exercises like pistol squats, walking lunges, Bulgarians, single leg deadlifts, all these exercises that people often do to minimize axial load, axial fatigue, but that other people criticize because they require stability or balance or whatever. Stability has become overrated in the context of hypertrophy. Just like a lot of the things in this discussion so far, yes, some is good. Does that mean that more is better forever and we have to stability max and strap ourselves down and have a belt on and everything for every single exercise to get a lot out of it? No, I don't think that that's going to necessarily lead to better gains compared to just making sure that we don't have the same kind of secondary or tertiary limiters on all of our exercises, or they could become significant. So if you have one exercise where there's a little bit of a balance component, for example, you're doing a pistol squat and maybe it's a little bit wobbly, I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. But if you have 6 exercises in a day that are all requiring some degree of balance or anti-rotation or anti-lateral flexion, that fatigue, that specific fatigue, is going to compound in a way that is going to compromise your outputs. So when it comes to pistol squats, lunges, Bulgarians, without getting too deep into the weeds on, how these exercises vary from one another, I'm just going to kind of give a little bit of a blanket statement here and say that all of those exercises have the potential to be at least B tier or higher if you stick with them long enough to have some degree of skill, and if you're pairing them intelligently with other heavier, more axially demanding exercises elsewhere in your program. However, if you don't develop skill with these exercises and say you just rotate in pistols for a 4-week block, I think that's a terrible idea. You're not going to get a lot out of pistol squats in a 4-week block. When it comes to a lot of unilateral options, there's just a little bit more buy-in, a little bit more skill cost. So think of it more as a long-term commitment. If you pick some of the variations that you like, for me, I love lunges and I love single leg deadlifts. I've been doing them consistently in my program for 15 years. I lunge over 4 plates. So when I hear people say stuff like lunges are unstable, I can't help but laugh when I can now lunge almost triple my body weight. Stick with these exercises for long enough, and some of these stability factors become kind of a moot point. That's not to say you should be doing Bosu ball variations and all those sorts of things, but within reason, a few exercises on one leg can absolutely be part of an optimal program overall. So maybe a little bit of an oversimplification here, but I think to some degree, variety for variety's sake is a little bit of a cheat code, a little bit of a way to kind of foolproof your program and make sure that you're not allowing any of these secondary or tertiary limiters to compound and become primary limiters. If you're just barbell back squatting and then doing stuff like leg extension and isolation machines and whatever, I don't think that axial fatigue is going to be a limiting factor. However, if you barbell back squat, barbell deadlift, hack squat, heavy farmer's carry, I think if you are doing all of those things in a workout, then the axial fatigue that originally was just kind of a secondary factor now becomes a primary limiter. When it comes to looking at variables and does it make an exercise A tier, B tier, C tier, whatever, it's hard to do that on an exercise by exercise basis. We really have to look at how is that variable being managed across the program overall. The topic of exercise variety brings me to my final point. If you want to hypertrophy max and get every bit of gains you can out of your program, can you just do the basics and squat, hinge, push, and pull? Or do you need to take a little bit more of a methodical approach, have a little bit more exercise variability, think about things like, am I training this muscle at long lengths and short lengths, for example? Overall, I think if you're a beginner, and we actually have some studies on this that look at how helpful is exercise variability for untrained lifters, where they give them very simple programs where they repeat just a couple exercises a couple days a week versus more complex programs where they do a wider range of exercises, different workouts on different days. And what we generally see is that for novice lifters, it doesn't really matter. I would say that simple is good. It's going to allow them to develop important fundamental skills with lifting, and that's going to take priority over some of the small theoretical gains we could get from a little bit more variability. For a more advanced lifter, looking at some topics like regional hypertrophy and just considering how when you've done 4 sets of an exercise, what is your quality going to be on that 5th set versus switching to something a little bit different? I think neurally, mentally, I think you're going to be able to keep output and quality a little bit higher, maybe reach some additional gains in terms of like regional hypertrophy, that kind of stuff, with a little bit more variability. So I kind of have a variability bias with advanced lifters. I'd say you can probably tackle a slightly broader exercise selection compared to a novice. But overall, I'd say compared to just literally squat, hinge, push, pull to failure all the time, do that versus really get into the weeds, get into the tiers list, train muscles at different lengths with different exercises, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. I still think we're talking about relatively small gains overall. With that in mind, the entire concept of a tiers list is a little bit silly. As you've seen here, pretty much every common quad exercise that I can think of, I've ranked at least B tier or above. I will say I think the entire concept of an S tier exercise, which if you notice I didn't rank any exercises as S tier, I think the entire premise of S tier is false to begin with. I suspect that we'll saturate the hypertrophy response that we can get from training before we've optimized every single variable on the individual level. For example, if we do studies and determine what is the optimal resistance profile to train a muscle at and what is the optimal volume to train a muscle at, what is the optimal, reps in reserve or intensity to train a muscle at, what's the optimal frequency, what's the optimal protein consumption. If we have all these variables and we know how to optimize each variable one by one, I suspect as you start going through and checking the boxes, your total hypertrophy gains are going to reach a plateau. It's going to saturate. That response is going to hit a cap before we've optimized every variable on the individual level. Can I say that for sure? And do I know how many variables do we need to optimize before, you reach close to that genetic potential? I'm not 100% sure, but I suspect that science in the future is going to be less useful when it comes to how to optimize each individual variable, and more interesting when it comes to how much do we need to optimize and how many variables do we need to optimize before we've done good enough. I strongly suspect that we are going to reach a plateau of good enough where further optimization of variables on the individual level is going to cease to have a meaningful or practical impact on your training outcomes. I think that is kind of the heart of a lot of the criticisms against science-based lifting, is a lot of people who are doing the basics. They're squatting, hinging, pushing, pulling. They're eating a lot of protein. They're sleeping well. They've done those things. They've tried to layer additional optimizations on top of that and not seen the payoff. And that I can completely understand, but I don't think that we know for sure kind of where that threshold is. When is enough? When is good enough? And are you at a point where you are doing enough things right that there's really nothing else you can do? That is the question that I have for science. I'd love to see more research on, theoretical maximums for peak muscle protein synthesis, how many variables we have to optimize to approach that hypothetical limit. But for now, when it comes to these tiers lists, ranges of motion, are you training with full stretch? Are you training at moderate muscle lengths? I just don't see the effect sizes in the literature to have, common good exercises ranked more than a tier or two apart. I think pretty much any exercise that you're going to think about doing in a gym is going to be A tier or B tier. Really silly stuff may get down to C tier. Wouldn't waste your time with certain kind of really, really funky exercises. Stuff that's like really squeezy, really sensation driven, probably not super worth your time. I don't think the S tier exists. I think for the most part, what we're doing with science-based lifting is really just arguing between A tier and B tier, which is interesting. It's fun. I like to do it, but I think it's important that we're honest and say that at the end of the day, all this stuff is going to work pretty well, talking about pretty small differences.